The semester always begins the same way: a shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, the scrape of chairs, the awkward energy of strangers forced together in the small orbit of a classroom. I have taught for years, long enough to recognize the patterns: eager faces at the front, the distracted in the back, and the uncertain ones hovering between. Yet every year, I feel a flicker of anticipation, as though a story is about to unfold, and I am both its witness and its guide. That morning, sunlight streamed through the high windows of the lecture hall, catching dust motes in its golden path. I opened my notes with a practiced calm, though beneath it lay the excitement that never truly fades. I scanned the room, my eyes moving automatically across the rows, until they stopped. Until they locked onto him, Jason Reeves. He was tall, his chestnut hair catching the light, his posture both confident and strangely restless. But it was his eyes that unsettled me, a piercing, steady brown gaze that held mine for a moment too long. It wasn't the stare of a student hungry for knowledge, nor the glazed indifference of one waiting for the clock to run down. It was something else, something alert, curious, almost daring. As the lecture moved forward, his presence became impossible to ignore. He took notes, yes, but his questions, when they came, were different. Not surface-level clarifications, but inquiries that dug deep into the marrow of the text. He challenged interpretations, not arrogantly, but with a kind of hunger, a need to uncover hidden layers. And every time he spoke, I felt a shift inside myself, a spark I had not expected, nor welcomed. The rest of the class blurred around me, the ordinary voices and laughter fading into background noise. I caught myself glancing toward him more than once, my own thoughts distracted, my words slightly faltering, as though his presence had unsettled the rhythm I had built over years of teaching. That invisible connection, silent, undeniable, began to weave itself between us, delicate but charged. I told myself it was nothing, that professors notice all kinds of students, that curiosity is a professional hazard. But deep down, even in that very first week, I knew. I knew the line of my life had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. In the quiet hum of the classroom, surrounded by notebooks and whispers, something dangerous had begun to stir. I told myself I wouldn't cross that line, that I wouldn't blur the boundaries between the life I had carefully built and the quiet storms beginning to rise inside me. Yet the truth is simpler and far harsher. When Jason asked if I would join him for coffee, I hesitated only for a moment. A moment too short to save me. The cafe was tucked away on a side street near the university, the kind of place where the world seemed to slow down. Its walls were lined with worn books, its lamps cast amber halos, and soft music drifted like a memory in the background. I sat across from him, a professor and her student, pretending at first that this was harmless. Two people discussing literature beyond the classroom. But as minutes stretched into hours, the air thickened with something neither of us named. He asked me about my life, not as a teacher, but as a woman. And I heard myself answering with a candor that startled me. I spoke of small disappointments, of the monotony that had settled over the years, of the hollow spaces I had learned to live with. And he listened, his eyes unwavering, his attention absolute, as though every word I said mattered. That alone was enough to crack something open in me. I noticed the way his hand rested near mine on the table, steady, unflinching. The way his smile appeared when I admitted, almost shyly, that I had once wanted more from life. And then came the moment that shifted everything. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative but deliberate, and instead of pulling away, I allowed it, allowed him. A warmth spread through me, fierce and unfamiliar, and I realized with a jolt that I hadn't felt that alive in years. Not in my marriage, not in my daily rituals, not even in the safe, ordered space of my career. It was terrifying and intoxicating all at once. When we finally stepped outside into the cool night, the stars overhead burned with cruel clarity. The city hummed quietly around us, but for me, the world narrowed to him alone. He leaned closer, And in that suspended instant, I could have walked away. I could have ended it before it began. Instead, I let his lips meet mine, sealing not just a kiss, but a choice. That kiss was both a beginning and an ending. The beginning of a story that would consume me, and the end of the woman I had been before. I walked away that night with my heart pounding, knowing I had crossed into dangerous territory. And yet, I didn't regret it. Not then. Once the line was crossed, there was no turning back. The coffee, the kiss, the quiet acceptance of what we had started. Each moment became a stone on the path we walked together, leading deeper into secrecy. At first, it was stolen glances in the classroom, brief sparks of recognition no one else seemed to notice. But soon, the walls of the university could no longer contain us. We began to carve out hidden spaces where we could exist beyond titles and expectations. There was the park with the ancient oak tree, its branches twisting skyward like a guardian of our reckless promises. We sat beneath its shade, speaking in hushed tones, our laughter dissolving into the rustle of leaves. We found corners in cafes no one from the university frequented, shadows where the world could not intrude. Every meeting carried a weight of danger, but the thrill only seemed to feed the fire between us. The secrecy became its own intoxicant. I felt alive in those hours, as if every nerve had awakened after years of numbness. But the more time I gave him, the heavier the guilt pressed upon me when I returned home. Michael, my husband, worked long hours as always, his absence a constant echo in our house. He wasn't blind, I knew that much. He noticed the way I drifted in thought, the way my phone seemed to hold my attention more than before. Still, he said nothing. Silence became his accusation. One night, after weeks of stolen afternoons, Jason took my hand and pulled me into a clearing. It was late, the sky heavy with stars, the world around us quiet. Without music, without reason, he began to sway, and I followed, laughing at first, then falling into the rhythm of his embrace. We danced beneath the indifferent heavens, our steps clumsy but our bodies aligned, as though some greater force had woven us together. In that midnight dance, he whispered not words but intentions, his determination, his desire, his certainty that what we shared was more than fleeting passion. And for a moment, I let myself believe him. I let myself surrender to the fantasy that love could rewrite the rules of the life I had already chosen. But shadows lingered at the edge of that moment. With every touch, every secret, I felt the weight of betrayal growing heavier. The passion was undeniable, but so too was the darkness gathering behind it. Each kiss was both salvation and damnation, and deep down, I knew the storm was coming. The first time Jason stepped across the threshold of my home, it felt like a point of no return. Until then, our meetings had lived in the shadows of parks, cafes, and nameless places that held no trace of permanence. But that evening, with Michael away on a business trip, I opened the door to my private world and invited the secret into the very center of my life. I remember preparing for it with meticulous care. I cooked dinner, though I barely touched it once he arrived. I wore a dress I had not chosen for my husband in years, and I lingered before the mirror longer than I dared admit. The house itself seemed complicit, its quiet corners waiting, its walls ready to absorb the confessions we had never dared to speak aloud. When Jason arrived, the air shifted instantly. His presence filled the space in a way that unsettled me, both thrilling and frightening. We sat at the table, pretending for a time that this was ordinary. Two people sharing food, sharing laughter. But beneath the small talk, desire simmered, unstoppable, relentless. By the time his hand touched mine, the pretense was gone. We crossed the line fully that night, surrendering to passion that had been building since the first day in the classroom. It wasn't just physical hunger, though the intensity of it left me breathless. It was emotional exposure, the raw unveiling of needs I had buried under years of routine. In his arms, I felt seen, desired, alive in a way I had long since forgotten was possible. When it was over, I lay in silence, my heart torn between elation and terror. Jason whispered words of love, of certainty, of a future he believed we could have together, and part of me wanted to cling to that vision, to drown in the warmth of it. Yet another part recoiled at the reality I could not escape. This was my home, the place I had built with Michael, the man whose absence hurt more in that moment than his presence ever had. By inviting Jason inside, I had not just betrayed my husband, I had desecrated the sanctity of the life I once vowed to protect. There was no undoing it, no erasing the imprint of that night. I lay awake long after Jason left, staring into the darkness, consumed by the knowledge that I had stepped past a boundary that could never be redrawn. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. And it was the moment I knew my life, as I had known it, was over. It was inevitable, though I spent weeks convincing myself it wasn't. I told myself I could balance it, that I could keep my secret world with Jason tucked neatly away from the life I had built with Michael. But lies have their own weight, and sooner or later, they drag everything into the open. Michael had always been observant, though he chose silence more often than confrontation. At first, it was his glances. Quick, sharp, lingering, just long enough to unsettle me. Then came the questions disguised as casual remarks. The subtle probing about where I had been, or why my smile seemed brighter at times. I brushed them aside, layering excuses over the cracks. But suspicion is a fire that feeds on the smallest spark. The breaking point arrived when Michael found the message. Jason's words, left carelessly on my phone, a thread of intimacy that could not be mistaken for anything else. I still remember the look on his face when he confronted me. It wasn't rage that struck me first, but devastation. His voice cracked, raw and wounded, when he asked me if it was true. I opened my mouth, but denial dissolved before it could form. The truth spilled out, jagged and merciless. The confrontation tore through us like a storm. He accused, I confessed. And in that space between words, years of marriage crumbled. He shouted once, but mostly he stood there, pale and trembling, as though betrayal had hollowed him from the inside. When he left that night, slamming the door behind him, the silence that followed was suffocating. Days later, he returned, calmer but colder. His decision was clear, his resolve unshaken. He couldn't forgive me. He wouldn't. Divorce was his answer, spoken without hesitation, delivered like a verdict. I tried to speak, to explain, but what could I say? That I hadn't meant for this to happen? That Jason had awakened something in me I thought was dead? None of it mattered anymore. As I signed the papers, I felt the finality of it sink into my bones. My marriage, once a fortress of familiarity, was gone, reduced to ashes by my choices. The guilt was crushing, the grief undeniable. Yet beneath the wreckage, I felt something else too. A strange, terrifying freedom. The old life I had clung to was gone, and in its place was the unknown. I had destroyed one world. Now I had to decide if I had the strength to build another. After the collapse, I staggered through the days like someone moving through ruins. The divorce papers sat heavy on my desk, and Michael's absence became a wound I could not bandage. Guilt clung to me, a shadow I carried from room to room. Every corner of the house echoed with what I had lost. Yet through that darkness, Jason remained. He stood beside me, steady where I was breaking, determined where I was afraid. I leaned on him more than I wanted to admit. At first, I feared he would tire of me, that the intensity of our affair would dissolve under the harsh light of reality. But he didn't falter. He carried me through the worst of it, through nights of tears and mornings when I doubted myself entirely. He reminded me, in his own quiet way, that the choices I had made weren't just destruction, they were also beginnings. Eventually, we left the house that bore too many memories. We found a small place on the edge of the city, a sanctuary with peeling paint and wildflowers growing untamed in the yard. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. Within those walls, we began again. Slowly, carefully, we built a rhythm, shared meals, laughter, that came more easily with time, and dreams whispered in the quiet before sleep. Even in that fragile happiness, I carried ghosts. Michael's face haunted me, his silence, his finality. There were days when I questioned if I had traded one life for another built on sand. Yet Jason never allowed me to sink completely into regret. His presence was unwavering, his love fierce in its simplicity. He believed in us with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Months passed, and the wounds began to scar over. Life no longer felt like something I was surviving, but something I was shaping again. Then, one evening, as the sun sank low and painted the world in amber, Jason knelt before me with a ring. The moment was simple, unadorned, yet profound. He asked for forever, and I said yes. Not because I had forgotten the past, but because I was ready to face a future, one of my own making. In that instant, I felt the shift once more. Not the dangerous spark of forbidden desire, but the quiet resolve of choosing love after the storm. We had endured guilt, loss, and consequence. What remained was the chance to rebuild. And I was ready. The day of our wedding was nothing like the one I had once imagined for myself. There was no cathedral, no grand ceremony, no crowd of expectant faces. Instead, there was a quiet lakeside, the water stretching wide and calm, and a handful of friends who had seen us through the fire. The simplicity of it made it feel truer, stripped of pretense, a vow whispered to the world rather than shouted. I stood in a simple dress, Jason at my side, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. The air was cool, the light fading into a sky brushed with pink and violet, and as we exchanged our vows, I thought not of the destruction behind us, but of the resilience that had carried us here. Our promises were not naive. They were forged from the knowledge of what love could cost, and the determination that it would not be squandered again. The honeymoon by the sea felt like a balm after years of turbulence. The salt air, the endless horizon, the rhythm of waves crashing against the shore, all of it carried us into a space where the past could not reach. I walked the beaches with him, hand in hand, feeling the tide wash over our feet, and I knew that what we had was no longer a rebellion against emptiness, but the foundation of something enduring. Time passed, as it always does, and with it came the slow maturing of love. The sharp urgency of our early days softened into steadier forms: trust, laughter, quiet rituals that bound us together. We learned to argue without shattering, to support without smothering, to forgive without hesitation. What began as a dangerous attraction had grown into a partnership, scarred but stronger for its trials. Looking back, I see the storm for what it was. A tearing apart, yes, but also a rebirth. Pain and betrayal left their marks, and I will never pretend otherwise. But from those ruins, a new life emerged, one I chose fully, knowing the cost and embracing it. As I sit now beside Jason, years later, I feel the weight of everything we endured and the quiet strength of what we have built. Our love was born in fire, but it has settled into something steadier, a flame that refuses to die. And though I carry my past like a shadow, I also carry this truth. From the wreckage of one life, another can be made. Fragile, flawed, but deeply, fiercely alive.